A lot of what you're going to see today is from this book, Improbable Planet, and also Designed to the Core. And I've been talking to a lot of you about creation and evolution. That just seems to be something you run into a lot when you're talking to people that are not yet followers of Jesus Christ. And I've debated a number of evolutionary biologists who are atheists over the years. And what I notice, they think that the history of life is all based on genetics and the fossil record. And frequently what I do is I say, well, have you taken into account the physics of the sun? And they all say, what does that have to do with the history of life? Well, what I want to share with you, it's got everything to do with the history of life. And it's one of the easiest ways of persuading people that the history of Earth's life is a supernatural event. It's not a natural event. Now, you might think it's all natural if all you look at is the genetics or the fossil record. But once you bring in the physics of the sun, it changes everything. You know, what we're trying to do at this conference is give you a little bit of an idea of the miracle of the sun that we're orbiting. So we're giving you kind of the tip of the iceberg. But what I want to share with you is something that I heard from Carl Sagan decades ago, the faint sun paradox. He was the one that coined this phrase, the faint sun paradox. So, yeah, here we go. Evidence for a biblical life history model. And naturalistic life history models consider only the life sciences data. They tend to ignore the physics of the sun, the earth, and the moon. The sun's the most important, but the changing physics of the earth and moon are also important. And how scientific models provably lack explanatory power or, if your model is not able to explain data that you see through all the scientific disciplines, chances are you got the wrong model. And that's how science works. We develop a model, we see how extensively accurate its explanatory power is. If it's able to explain more and more, as we learn more and more, we know we're on the right track. But if things get worse and worse as we learn more and more, that's a good sign that maybe we got the wrong model. Okay. The sun is a changing body. That's what I've discovered when I debate evolutionary biologists. They presume the sun has not changed over its history. It's changed a lot over its history. And I'd like to remind people that stars are a lot like human beings. They're unstable when they're young, they're unstable when they're old, they're maximally stable when they're middle-aged. But there's a big difference between stars and human beings. We humans are stable for most of our lifespan. Stars, on the other hand, are stable for just a very tiny fraction of their lifespan. So, for example, this shows you the flaring activity of our star, the sun. And what you notice here is that the sun's flaring activity was extreme when the sun was young, and will be extreme in the future. This is logarithmic. So what you notice between, like, say, 0 and the first billion years, the sun's flaring activity is 10,000 to 100,000 times greater than it is today. In the future, likewise, it's going to get really serious. Right now, it's at its minimum point. And so there's a very narrow window where the flaring activity is sufficiently minimal that we can have global human civilization. For example, there was a flare in 1859 that knocked out all the telegraph systems. If we were to get a flare like that today, it would shut down most of the world's electric power grids, which would be quite serious. Your refrigeration systems would be gone. It would knock out our GPS satellites. My son's response was, well, if we lose the GPS satellites, that's the end of civilization as we know it. So, some of you remember when we didn't have GPS satellites, right? Okay, but what you notice here is that the flaring activity is minimal when the sun is actually halfway through its nuclear burning phase. Our sun can burn for 9 billion years. Right now we're halfway through. When you're at the midpoint, this is when the flaring activity is minimal enough for global civilization. And it's also when the sun has its best luminosity stability. And the luminosity stability we need to have global human civilization is only 100,000 years wide. It's about 90,000 years wide. and we're about halfway through that window right now. So if you've got an investment portfolio that extends out to 50,000 years, you might want to go for short-term investments because the sun's luminosity stability is not going to last that much longer. Okay. Now, something else about the sun is that it gets brighter and brighter as it gets older and older. And the reason why this is happening is that once the sun's mass stabilizes, which happens when it's about 500 million years old, that's when the sun is igniting nuclear fusion, where it's fusing hydrogen into helium. But as it continues to fuse hydrogen to helium, helium is denser than hydrogen. And so as the density of the nuclear furnace in the core of the sun gets greater and greater, that nuclear furnace burns with ever greater efficiency. So the sun gets brighter and brighter as it gets older and older. And today, the sun's about 23% brighter than it is when God created life on planet Earth 3.8 billion years ago. And this is what's referred to as the faint sun paradox. The paradox is this: how is it that life has persisted on planet Earth for 3.8 billion years when the sun is now 23% brighter than it was when life first appeared? And here's the problem. It only takes a tiny change in the sun's luminosity to make our planet uninhabitable. So for example, if you have a 2% drop in the solar luminosity, that would cause a runaway glaciation. If the sun were to get 2% dimmer than it is, that means that you would have more snow falling on the earth instead of rain. Snow reflects sunlight with 60 to 70% efficiency, which is going to make it cooler, which is going to cause more snow to fall, and in a very short time the entire planet is covered with ice and it becomes uninhabitable. You get a similar situation if you make the sun slightly brighter. So a 4% increase in the solar luminosity would cause a runaway evaporation. Namely, that if you make the sun brighter, that's going to cause more water vapor to evaporate, and water vapor is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat from the sun, which makes it warmer, which evaporates more water, and eventually you got no ice and no liquid water on the face of the earth. It's all steam, and the planet becomes uninhabitable. Now this 2% and 4% is for primitive microbes. If we're talking plants and animals, less than a 1% change means you can't have plants and animals on the face of the earth. So even a 1% change is catastrophic for everything except microbes. So this is the challenge. How is it that we have life persisting for 3.8 billion years when the sun is now 23% brighter than it was at the origin of life? Well, astronomers and physicists and chemists began to look at this faint sun paradox and say, well, there's got to be a solution because we know life has been here for 3.8 billion years. Let's see if we can figure out how it is that we've had life on planet Earth all this time. And what they pointed out is that, yes, we got the sun getting brighter and brighter, but if we can make things change in the atmosphere of the Earth or the surface of the Earth or the ocean, maybe we can compensate for the brightening of the sun. And so somehow, as the sun gets brighter and brighter, we have factors on the surface of the Earth that would trap less heat from the sun, and that would keep the temperature at that optimal level for life. Well, over the past 45 years, astronomers, physicists, and chemists have proposed 15 different ways we can compensate for the brightening of the sun. Now, this is a short talk, so I'm not going to explain these 15 factors, but I will show them to you. So these are the different factors that astronomers and physicists and chemists have proposed over the past 45 years as a way to compensate for the brightening of the sun so life can persist here on planet Earth. But here's the problem. Not one of these is adequate to compensate for the brightening of the sun, and even all 15 together are not adequate to compensate for the brightening of the sun. And so this is the conundrum. How is it that we've been able to maintain life on planet Earth for 3.8 billion years when even these 15 different factors, they all do help, but none of them help to a sufficient degree, and even all 15 only help to a tiny fraction. The missing factor that had been ignored for 45 years is the factor that plays the biggest role and is the key factor in compensating for the brightening of the sun is life itself. Life is a factor that compensates for the brightening of the sun. But you need different life at different times throughout the history of life. So when you look at the fossil record, what do you notice? You got different life at different times throughout the past 3.8 billion years. And evolutionary biologists said, well, evolution explains why we get this differentiation of life. Well, what I'm going to suggest is that it's not evolution, it's a creator that's intent on compensating for the brightening of the sun and make sure we have just the right life at just the right time and just the right abundance and diversity to perfectly compensate for the brightening of the sun so we can have this huge abundance of life, diverse life throughout the past 3.8 billion years. So we humans come upon the scene. We have all the biodeposit resources we need to launch and sustain civilization and take the good news of salvation to all the people groups of the world. I mean, just walk around here. Look at all the limestone that exists around here. Well, that limestone came from billions of years of life that preceded us. Almost all the limestone on planet Earth is biogenic. And there's 76 quadrillion tons of it on the face of the Earth. And so the bottom line here is it takes just right life on Earth at just right times to compensate for the sun's increasing brightness. And life plays a far bigger role than all the 15 factors that have been suggested in the past in compensating for the brightening of the sun. Now, when I first met my wife and she saw me speaking to audience, she says, well, number one, it helps to look at people because I would just stare at the floor for the whole 3 hours. So she trained me how to look at people. She also said, get rid of those equations. She says, most Americans are not that literate when it comes to equations, but I'm breaking a rule right now. I'm going to show you an equation. And this is the equation that's most important for compensating for the brightening of the sun. And here we go. And hey, if you remember your high school chemistry, this is really easy stuff. So, and what we're talking about here are silicates. The continental land masses are basically silicates. And what we notice is that we live on a planet where we get abundant rainfall. Well, what's interesting is as raindrops fall on the silicates, they act as a catalyst. They stimulate a reaction which causes the silicates to react with the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what do? They convert it into carbonates and sand. Sand is silicon dioxide, carbonates, calcium carbonate. You see that right there. But notice, as this reaction runs, you start off with silicates, you end up with carbonates and sand. Well, silicates are a useless industrial product. Carbonates and sand are very valuable industrial. I mean, look at all these concrete structures. Carbonates and sand is what you basically use to make all these concrete structures and freeways, etc. And so rain falling on the silicates converts a useless mineral into two really valuable minerals. In fact, what I've noticed is that sand is now considered so valuable, Asian countries are coming here to North America and taking our sand and sending it over there. Because you think there's a lot of sand on planet Earth, but human civilization has such a high demand for carbonates and sand that we're basically scouring the planet to find it. But thanks to rain falling for billions of years, we have a huge abundance of both carbonates and sand. But notice, this reaction pulls carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so this reaction is causing carbon dioxide levels to drop. Now, at the origin of life, we had about 30,000 parts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere per million. Today, we have 400. So we've gone from 30,000 down to 400. And that's all because of what we call this silicate-carbonate reaction that's been going on. But what facilitates this reaction is life. And so different life forms will cause this reaction to run at a slow rate or a faster rate. And what's necessary to compensate for the brightening of the sun is that you want to begin with this reaction happening slowly and speeding up as you go throughout the history of life, so that we keep the temperature at the surface of the Earth optimal for life. Because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. It traps heat from the sun. So you want lots of heat trapping effects when the sun is dim, and you want less when the sun is bright. So this is the faint sun paradox. How as the sun gets brighter and brighter, life basically regulates the removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere so that the temperature of the surface of the Earth throughout those 3.8 billion years remains optimal for a huge abundance and diversity of life. Now, at the origin of life, what do we have? Microbial mats. So this is an example of a microbial mat that's very thin. So this shows you what life looks like 3 billion years ago. These thin mats of bacteria. And what they do is they very slightly break up the silicates, which allows the rain to come into contact with a greater surface. So if you got no life at all, the rain is just falling on the silicates. But life has the way of breaking up these silicates and allowing more contact between the rain and the silicates. Then as you move forward a billion years, you have these cryptogamic soils that look like this. Instead of being just a millimeter thick or less, we now have several millimeters. And so this actually penetrates the silicates to a greater degree and allows more of the rain to come into contact with the silicates and causes the reaction to run at a faster rate. Then as you move on in history, you begin to have primitive plants, and now they have roots that will go down into the silicates, and that allows the rain not only to hit the surface of the silicates, but to go deeper into the soil, down to about 1 foot. And so this greatly increases the contact between rain and the silicates, and now we got the reaction going more efficiently. And then today we have this situation where you got trees growing on solid granite. I mean, this is Cathedral Peak in the High Sierra Mountains. And notice you've got trees growing into solid granite almost all the way up to the top. And what do these trees do? They have roots that are able to break up the silicates. I mean, it's amazing. These roots have such great energy with them. They can break up the silicates and they can penetrate up to 30 feet into solid granite. And what this does is it allows rain to go down 30 feet in depth and causes the silicate reaction to run even more efficiently. Now, vegetation on the continental land masses, this enhancement of the silicate reaction accounts for 80% of the gradual removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Another 20% comes from the burial of organic carbon. And this is where you got plants and vegetation, microbes growing on the continental land masses. They die, and then you have floods or volcanic eruptions, which buries this material. And what's being buried? Carbonaceous material. And so life that would normally die and decay and release carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and methane to the atmosphere, another greenhouse gas, instead it gets buried, it gets trapped. And so rather than that carbon dioxide being released, it gets buried into the crust of the Earth. And that burial has another effect. It makes coal, it makes natural gas, it makes petroleum. And these are future biodeposits that we can mine from the crust of the Earth and use that to launch and sustain our civilization. And so this basically just shows you how you get vegetation growing and dying. And what you notice is if you're in a rainforest, the soil is black. The reason why it's black, that's dead vegetation that has been decayed, it becomes black. But if you've got a nice flood happening in the wintertime, it gets buried, gets deposited, and converted to coal, oil, and natural gas. Efficient silicate erosion and organic carbon burial, it requires enduring aggressive plate tectonics. And I just wrote an article. I put out a feature called Today's New Reason to Believe on our website. and one that got posted a few weeks ago, is now new research shows that plate tectonics was launched at the same time as the origin of life. And there's a reason for that. Life requires plate tectonics, and plate tectonics requires life. So we were anticipating that they would both start at the same time. We now have scientific measurements that prove that they got launched at the same time. Now, we need the plate tectonics to sustain life because the plate tectonics recycles the nutrients that life needs. Those nutrients get buried into the crust of the earth and into the mantle, but the plate tectonics recycles what is buried back up to the surface so life can continue on the face of the earth. If you shut down plate tectonics, you also shut down life because they run out of the nutrients. On the other hand, microbial life has the property that it absorbs uranium. One of the blessings of planet Earth, we're a super uranium-rich planet. We have 340 times as much uranium as what you would expect on other rocky planets in the universe. And uranium actually can be precipitated by organisms, microbial life. And so what happens is that as runoff brings these microbial creatures, live and dead, it brings them into the subduction zones, the places where two plates come close together. And what that uranium precipitate does as these microbes die, it provides heat. Not much heat, but enough heat to accelerate a chemical reaction that makes talc. And talc is a lubricant. And so when you look at these tectonic plates, you see that there's talc there that allows the plates to slide over one another or to go by one another. And this is important. If you don't have sufficient microbial activity on the face of the earth, there will not be enough heat brought into the subduction zone to maintain the plate tectonics. So plate tectonics needs life, and life needs plate tectonics. We now know they both happen at the same time. That's just a little bit of the fine-tuning that's necessary to sustain the plate tectonics, to sustain life here on planet Earth. What I've done in the book Improbable Planet is to talk about 30 different factors that must be fine-tuned to sustain the plate tectonics. But I wanted to bring the synergism in here for you. And so long-lasting plate tectonics requires enduring, abundant photosynthetic life. It's the photosynthetic life that precipitates this uranium that provides the necessary heat. And this just basically shows you 4 different tectonic fine-tuning features. There's 30 of them, but these are the 4 that are most significant. You need a planet with lots of uranium and thorium. And I said uranium, we're 340 times more abundant than what you'd expect for other rocky planets. With thorium, we're 630 times more abundant. And what I've done in my books is explain why Earth has such a huge quantity of uranium and thorium. Now, we can use it for making nuclear power plants, but it's crucial to sustain life here on planet Earth. Now, life compensates for the increasing heat of the sun, the increasing brightness of the sun in 4 different ways. The erosion of silicates is the most important factor, the burial of organic carbon, but there are 2 other factors that also play a role. Life changes the atmospheric chemistry in the cloud cover. And so if you've got more clouds, as you notice today, it blocks some of the heat of the sun. And so life actually plays a role in what it emits into the atmosphere of enhancing or decreasing the cloud cover. And notice that different life forms have different colors. And so if you've got life forms that are white or light yellow, they're going to reflect more light. And if you've got life forms that are black or brown, it's going to absorb more light. And so notice 2.5 to 3 billion years ago, we had these black cryptogamic soils on the continental landmasses. What did that do? It absorbed more heat from the sun. That's when the sun was a lot dimmer. Now, if you wander around this campus here, I've actually found some places where there's cryptogamic crusts, but they're about the size of a silver dollar. So they don't do much to absorb heat from the sun. But 3 billion years ago, they played a crucial role in ensuring enough heat was absorbed to help compensate for the brightening of the sun. So it actually affects the reflectivity of planet Earth. And it's these four factors that work in concert with one another to ensure that we get just the right life on planet Earth at just the right time. And here's the bottom line. Someone with a mind who knows the future physics of the sun, the earth, and the moon must remove no longer compensating life and replace it with just the right life forms at just the right times and just the right amounts in just the right locations. Now, what I've noticed when I debate evolutionary biologists, they say, well, how do you Christians explain these mass extinction events we see in the fossil record? I mean, there's frequent times where half the species of life on planet Earth is suddenly driven to extinction, as much as 95% is driven to extinction. They said, I thought your God was a loving God. Why would he wipe out all this life? Well, what God is doing is coming into our planet, removing life that is not effective anymore at removing sufficient greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and replacing it with new life that actually is more efficient at removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Just right life at just right times and just the right abundance and diversity is crucial for removing the just right amounts of greenhouse gases at just the right time to keep the temperature on the surface of the Earth optimal for life. And what we notice is that these mass extinction events are always followed rapidly by mass speciation events. So yeah, you get half to 75% to 95% of all species of life wiped out, but very quickly thereafter you got millions of new species that appear suddenly in the Earth. A huge challenge for naturalistic evolutionary models. How do you explain millions of species of life suddenly and simultaneously appearing on our planet at just the right time? And how do you explain the fact that those new species of life are more efficient at removing greenhouse gases at just the right level to compensate for the future physics of the sun? Again, my point is it takes a mind that knows that physics to make sure we got just the right life. If you don't have a mind, you're going to have the wrong life at the wrong times, and if you have that, the planet becomes permanently sterile, no more life on planet Earth. Now, this is actually referred to in Scripture. It's in the longest of the creation Psalms. If you look at Psalm 104, it's a psalm talking about how God packs our planet with as much life as possible and as diverse as possible, and evidently for as long as possible. And basically that's a psalm that people have gone to. It says God must really enjoy creating. Look at the abundance of what he's created. Look at the diversity of what he's created. But as you get to the end of Psalm 104, you see this statement, verses 29 and 30, referring to life on planet Earth. They die and return to the dust. When you send your spirit, they are created and you renew the face of the earth. And so the Bible said it thousands of years ago. We just discovered in the last few decades that there's these mass extinction events followed by mass speciation events. But 3,000 years ago, the Bible is telling us this is what God does. He removes life from planet Earth, replaces it with new life, but does it in such a way that he can sustain a great abundance and diversity of life on planet Earth for a sufficient time to provide all the resources that we humans need to launch civilization. And again, you say, where is God's love in this? God's love is, and what you notice in Genesis is this: God puts a higher value on birds and mammals, the soulish life, than he does the purely physical life, and puts the highest value in the spiritual life. And so, in one sense, he uses the microbes to benefit the birds and the mammals. He uses the birds and mammals to benefit us. And what he's basically doing is engineering the history of life in such a way to ensure that he is able to maximally bless and benefit us human beings, and to a secondary degree to bless the soulish animals, the birds and mammals that God created to relate to us and to serve and please us. And one of the books I wrote, Hidden Treasures in the Book of Job, makes the point that God designed these birds and mammals to serve and please us and relate to us, a higher species. Guess what? He designed us to relate to a higher being and to serve and please that higher being. And these animals teach us crucial spiritual lessons. Well, back to this faint sun paradox problem. What astronomers have discovered, if you want to optimally have the resources that we humans need to launch a sustained civilization, you're going to want a mass extinction event occurring about every 30 to 35 million years, quickly followed by a mass speciation event. Well, guess what? The fossil record now demonstrates that it happens every 30 to 35 million years. And we now understand what drives the periodicity. Every 30 to 35 million years, our solar system passes through the plane of our galaxy. When we pass through the plane of our galaxy, we come into contact with dense molecular clouds in our galaxy. And it's these dense molecular clouds that disturb the asteroid and comet belts. And so there's been a big debate for a long time. What drives the mass extinction events? Is it volcanic eruptions happening all over the world, or is it big asteroids and comets striking the Earth? We now know it's not either or, it's both and. If you get a big enough asteroid or comet striking the Earth, that will ignite volcanic eruptions all over the world. And so it's a combination of these two things that explains the mass extinction events. The dates for both are now known to be identical, but what's really amazing is how quickly these events are followed by a mass speciation event. And so we now understand that the just right frequency indeed is reflected in the fossil record. What's driving naturalistic evolution? You know, as I debate these evolutionary biologists, they say, look, we're tired of you creationists calling us Darwinists. We're not Darwinists. We're not neo-Darwinists, but they are naturalistic evolutionists. And the reason why they deny the term neo-Darwinism, Darwinism is the idea that what drives the history of life is natural selection. That's all Charles Darwin knew about. Neo-Darwinism, as they said, it's not just natural selection, they're mutations. But today, evolutionary biologists say, don't put us into that narrow of a camp. It's not just natural selection and mutations. There's gene exchange that happens. You especially see that at the microbial level, where one microbial species will share genes with another one. And then there's epigenetics that we see with a higher species. So they have four mechanisms. And there's been a lot of research. Is there a fifth mechanism? There could be, but the scientific literature is now, as there's a consensus, if there is a fifth mechanism, its contribution is less than 0.5% to the changes of life. So we really are in a position where we know the four predominant naturalistic mechanisms. But all of these mechanisms produce relatively small changes in different species of life. So the naturalistic evolutionary model basically states that life becomes gradually and progressively more complex through common descent, with changes brought about by natural selection, mutations, gene exchange, and epigenetics. And what does this predict? It predicts that evolutionary mechanisms will use the proliferation of additional species, and if you have sufficient time, these new species that are produced will produce new genera. The proliferation of new genera over yet much more time will produce new families over much more time, new orders, and then the new orders eventually will make new classes, and the new classes finally new phyla. But here's the problem with that model. What we see in the fossil record is not that you get the species first and you get the phyla last, it's the exact opposite. You get the phyla first and you get the species last. So the fossil record reveals the new phyla appear suddenly, they appear simultaneously, and they appear the moment that the physical and chemical conditions permit their existence. The two best examples of this would be the Avalon and Cambrian explosions. So for the first 3 billion years, we got nothing but microbes. And then 575 million years ago, you get the appearance of animals with body sizes as big as 2 meters across. But these are filter feeders. They don't have a digestive tract. They don't have a circulatory system or a skeleton or complex organs. And then at 538 million years ago, the These are replaced by the Cambrian explosion, where for the first time you got animals with a circulatory tract, a skeleton, a brain, a heart, circulatory system. But what we notice is the phyla, the basic body plans, show up at the beginning of the Avalon and the beginning of the Cambrian, and they don't show up sequentially over the whole of the Cambrian. They all show up at the beginning of the Cambrian. They show up suddenly and simultaneously. It's the opposite of what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective. And they show up the time when oxygen suddenly allows them to exist. So for example, to have microbes, all you need is like 0.1% oxygen in the atmosphere. And until 575 million years ago, there was never more than 2% oxygen in the atmosphere. And that explains one reason why we have nothing but microbes for the first 3 billion years. There's not enough oxygen for animals. For animals, you need a minimum of 8%. Now what happens at 575 million years ago, the oxygen level suddenly jumps from less than 2% to 8%. It's a very sudden jump generated by what's called the Great Unconformity, a geological event where you got massive landslides coming off the continents, the ocean. It drives a deep oxygen cycle and causes the oxygen to suddenly jump from 2% to 8%. The moment it hits 8%, you got the Avalon animals. Now there's a second geological event that jumps it up to 10%. That happened 538 million years ago. The moment it went from 8% to 10%, you immediately have the Cambrian animals. There's no time delay. They show up the moment that oxygen hits 10%. You get 50 different basic body plans of life or more that show up at the beginning of the Cambrian, including the phylum that we're all part of. We're all part of the chordate phylum. That's the phylum described by animals that have a long neural cord. It includes all the vertebrates. It includes a number of invertebrates. They're there at the beginning of the Cambrian, including even the vertebrates. They found vertebrate species at the very beginning of the Cambrian explosion. It's the opposite of what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective, but it's exactly what you'd expect if you've got a mind, a creator, who's intent on packing our planet with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible, and making sure we get humans here on planet Earth at just the right time in the history of the sun that we can thrive. So he's on a race to try to get everything ready when the sun is 4.57 billion years old. He knows that's the optimal moment for human life. But it takes very aggressive creative activity to speed things along from 3.8 billion years ago to the present in order to get everything set in place so that we humans can have all the biodeposit resources we need for life and the conditions we need for life. So the fossil record reflects a creator that's impatient. He's in a hurry. He's aggressive in making sure that everything is done as quickly as possible to prepare conditions for us human beings. What you see in Psalm 104 is this statement: "How many are your works, O Lord? In wisdom you made them all. The earth is full of your creatures." Or what you see in the book of Isaiah: "He did not create it to be empty, but formed it to be inhabited." And evidently he was doing that continuously throughout the 3.8 billion years. Again, you can read more about this in the book Improbable Planet.